This day has come after tormenting yourself in the skin of a crusading legionary and a samurai. We're going to the place everyone dreams of visiting. Sparta, of course, the toughest state in history. Today we grow dice on the press and go under the command of King Leonidas to fight the Persians and find out what the heroic deed of 300 Spartans was really like. Unfortunately, real life is very different from what movies and games show. But that's what our channel is for, right? So vote. Would you like to go to Sparta in the comments and get ready? It will be very brutal. Let's start with some historical background. The very name of the state of Sparta is not too correct and was established thanks to the Romans. If you look at any shield of a Spartan warrior, you can clearly see the letter L in Greek, which sounds like lambda. The reason is simple: the Spartans did not call themselves Spartans, but Lacedaemonians, in honor of the city of Lacedaemon. Even seasoned historians began to refer to the city more often as Sparta, from which the modern name is derived. The second prejudice positions Sparta as a closed city. No, friends, Sparta is a state that existed for almost 1,000 years, from the 11th to the 1st century BC. At that time there were many states on the territory of Greece, and our Sparta was located in the south of the Peloponnese Peninsula. By the way, the concept of concise speech came from there, because the people who inhabited Sparta are not alive. This is where our Spartan Robert was born. It's somewhere around 480 BC. Sparta is stronger than ever. The state extends its influence over almost the entire Peloponnesian Peninsula. Nearby is the Athenian power, which our state does not like. But Athens is not the problem. To the east is a vast empire of the Achaemenids, popularly known as the Persians. They don't know the nature of the Greeks and are driven by one simple goal: to take over all Greek land. This is a serious problem, because one look at a map is enough to realize how much more resources, people, and banal unity the Persians have. While Greece was divided into small states that only joined the union when threatened, the Persians fought with one front, one whole. In retrospect, we see that they lost. But why? Yes, because the art of war is sacred to the Greeks and life to the Spartans. Our Robert is a typical Goy. That's what they called full citizens in Sparta. There were simple working Maphakians. There were Neodaemons, who were considered only half-citizens. But the worst fate awaited the Ilotes. For the record, Ilotes are landowners who occupy an intermediate position between serfs and slaves. Ilotes are a poor caste of Spartans, mostly farmers. But the structure of Sparta was more complicated than in similar states. For example, our Robert's family could have a dozen islets with plots of land. On paper, they were serfs obliged to give Robert's family a fixed percentage of the harvest. The difference between Sparta and other states of the time is that the lord could not increase this percentage. It was set by law. Robert was lucky to be a citizen of Sparta, because for every citizen there were 10 islets, who often organized rebellions. They were punished as harshly as possible, and once a year the Spartan rulers even declared war on their own islets, to weed out the most aggressive and keep everyone in line. You're not wrong. The Spartans did declare war on themselves. We're talking about one of the most brutal states in history. Everything was subordinated to the one goal of war. Robert, like other boys of 7, left his family and went to the barracks. There, Spartan boys were divided into groups and taught military arts, sports, and even reading, which was unusual for the time. There was always an adult around the children. The children walked without shoes and wore the same clothes in winter and summer. Their diet was another story. All the teenagers ate a special broth. It's called Spartan chowder. It is pork cooked in blood and vinegar. It's almost impossible to eat, and the children were starving. It was encouraged by the state. Sparta had a cult of simplicity and a cult of strength, and no one stopped teenagers from stealing. The punishment was severe, but a thief who was not caught was actually praised for his skill. It is worth mentioning the most popular myth. It sounds like this: children unfit for service were thrown down the mountain. This story comes from the philosopher Plutarch, who in the 1st century of our era said that the council showed suspicious children were thrown off the cliff of Apotheida. Allegedly, no one asked the parents, and the case was forced. The problem is that Greek historians liked to embellish reality. In reality, things were much simpler. The practice of murder was common not only in Sparta, but also in other areas of Greece and Rome. But it was for very sick children, and there was a whole class of relatively inferior citizens. They were called hypomneons. They weren't very respected, but they weren't thrown off the mountain. And archaeologists have long since examined all the ravines where children were supposedly thrown, and found no remains. If you are interested, Please support us by liking and subscribing. We are trying to make the content better and more interesting. Back to Robert. Children were not allowed to wear clothes until they were 12 years old, and until then they were run naked. They slept in the barracks on straw bedding, and on cold days many put nettles on the bedding. Burning the body warmed it, and the boys survived to pass the final test at the age of 17 and climb the temple of Artemis. It was high up in the mountains, and the test consisted of a brutal flogging. The boy had to endure a series of lashes that stopped only after the first blood was drawn, and when the Spartans broke into a scream, the lashes continued even after the blood was drawn, only increasing in intensity. Such is the final test of the Spartacus warrior. Our Robert is a true warrior and passed the test perfectly, but the test only gave him the right to leave the closed barracks and appear in public. At 17, Robert had just begun his military service to the state. To understand how difficult it is, let's talk about pay. As we have already mentioned, even good food was considered a luxury in Sparta, so the phrase about the Spartan diet is not an empty one. In 1 month, Robert received a standard ration of 3.5 buckets of barley, 2.5 kilograms of cheese, 1 kilogram of dates, and about 5 liters of wine. Robert, like other Spartan soldiers, was also given several metal ingots, each weighing 625 grams. But that's another story. In an effort to avoid luxury and inequality, the Spartan ruler Lycurgus came up with an interesting solution. The death penalty was introduced for the accumulation of silver and gold, and the money on the territory of Sparta was just these iron bars. One weighed 625 grams, and to buy anything of value, the money had to carry whole buckles. The idea was simple because every big transaction became public. It was impossible to carry so much money without being noticed. And if the transaction is public, then it can be interested and find out where the person has so much money. A resident of another country who came to Sparta was faced with the fact that he could not buy anything. Spartans looked with horror at gold and silver coins. Such a system completely killed corruption, robbery, and plunder. What's the point of taking a bribe if you have to build a whole barn to store the money and attract attention? So Robert received a few twigs in addition to his meager ration. They could buy 20 pounds of meat with it, while training daily at the risk of their lives. After all, one Spartan warrior was worth a dozen others, and this principle had to be maintained. In general, the equipment of the warriors is not badly conveyed by the film about 300 Spartans. Our Robert, like any heavily armed hoplite, wore a round shield, a helmet, and a breastplate. For some reason, the movie decided to leave the Spartans' torsos uncovered. But of course that's stupid. It's not safe in the real world. There were also light Spartan infantrymen with spears, bows, and even darts. These guys fought with everything, because from the age of 7 they were trained to use any weapon. The organization of the Spartan army was unique, and some details are still successfully stolen by modern armies. A clear, linear formation in line. Strict discipline and incredible physical strength made the Spartan army invincible at the time. Lined up in a phalanx 8 rows deep, it could stretch for a kilometer. Until the 371st year BC, it was considered physically impossible to defeat such an army. The reason is simple. Unlike other armies, the Spartans did not have an engineering mind. They simply marched forward, relying on brute force, and they excelled at it, defeating every opponent. Back to Robert. Let's remember that it is 480 BC, and the war with the Persians is in full swing. Sparta is ruled by King Leonidas, who, like everyone around him, is a fine warrior. Everyone is familiar with the movie about the 300 Spartans, and we will not repeat the obvious things, but only focus on the differences between the movie and reality. Let's assume that among the 300 is our Robert, along with King Leonidas, who actually fought on the front lines with the warriors. Robert is holding a defense against the Persian army in the gorge of Thermopylae. According to various estimates, there were as many as 250,000 Persians facing only 7,000 Greek warriors. It should be noted that the number of Spartans is not accidental. 300 people are the personal guard of the king and the best warriors. They really held out for 2 long days, outnumbering their enemy 20 to 1. They would have held out even longer had not a local resident, Ilotes, who decided to make some money, told the Persians about a mountain trail that could bypass the Greek positions. Spartan intelligence was the best in those days, and Leonidas was the first to know. The king immediately sent the entire army home, leaving only 300 hoplite guards behind. There was no greater sin in Sparta than retreating from the battlefield without a clear order. for Leonidas was king. There was no one to wait for an order, and in order not to become an outcast whose name is covered with shame, Leonidas was left to his own devices, and our Robert chose a similar fate. The film forgot only one detail. Along with the Spartans, other Greeks voluntarily stayed behind. In particular 700 inhabitants of Thespia and 400 boys from Thebes. Yes, and besides the Spartans, there were the Ilotes, about whom we spoke earlier. The number of slaves is not specified, but the fact that in the campaigns of them made a kind of light infantry is officially confirmed. This means that not 300, but about 1,500 people opposed Xerxes. But even this does not cancel the fact of a crazy feat. After all, these slaves put about 5,000 Persians, and not easy. And including the immortal guard of the Persian army, in total, 4,000 Greeks died in 3 days. And the losses of the Persians exceeded this number more than 5 times, mainly due to the psychological factor. In the future, the Greeks would win the war and make a very favorable peace. Don't be sad for our Robert. As you may have learned, he did not have the easiest life, and to die in battle was the highest honor for a Spartan. For example, one of the 300 Spartans, Aristodemus, was ill at the time of the battle. Leonidas sent him to the countryside for treatment, and after the king and his guard were killed, Aristodemus returned to Sparta. There he was nicknamed Aristodemus the Coward, and even the man's later exploits did not affect his position in society. 1 year later, in the year 479 B.C., another Spartan, Pausanias, led the Greek army in the final battle against the Persians. It took place near the city of Plataea and resulted in the total defeat of the Persians, even though they outnumbered the Greeks 3-1. Aristodemus, a member of the original group of 300 Spartans, became the hero of the battle, but this did not change his attitude. In conclusion, let us note another curious fact. If Spartan boys were trained from childhood for war, girls were trained for childbirth, their lives were much easier. Girls were taught to write, to play sports, and their health was carefully monitored. In a sense, Sparta can be considered the progenitor of feminism, because even with weapons, Spartan women coped perfectly. That was a few thousand years ago, and only 100 years ago in some countries women could not even vote. It's a clear demonstration that progress is relative, but no matter how hard the life of the Spartans was, they have earned a place in history for all centuries. That's all we have. And if you like the transformation into a Spartan, do not forget to like and sign it. And also offer your ideas for future episodes in the comments. And we say goodbye. See you again, our historian.